Hello everyone, I'm Mark Selleck and welcome back to Casting Through Ancient Greece for this interview episode, Eternal Myths with Bernie Taylor. Bernie Taylor is an independent naturalist, thought leader, and author whose research explores the mythological connections and biological knowledge amongst prehistoric, indigenous, and ancient peoples. His works in these areas include Biological Time, 2004, and Before Orion, Finding the Face of the Hero, 2017. Before Orion is premised on Joseph Campbell's hero's journey monomyth, that is at the core of the stories worldwide amongst indigenous peoples, the ancients, and our modern society. Before Orion explores a deeper root for this monomyth by looking at how hunter-gatherers viewed themselves within the natural and spiritual worlds through Palaeolithic cave art from 40,000 years ago. Taylor proposes that select cave paintings are fundamental pieces of the human journey to self-realization, the foundation of written language, and a record of biological knowledge that invariably impacted some artistic styles, religious practices, and stories that are still with us today. Taylor addresses the profound archaeological elephant in the room by opening up an uncharted place in our history, which points to the cultural ancestors of mankind in Western North Africa. Before Orion will change the idea of who you think you are. For this episode, we're going to be moving away a little from the narrative approach that we have usually followed. For this episode, we'll be turning to the realm of myth that we have only really covered in passing throughout the series. Though we will not be running through the usual stories of Greek mythology, we will be instead looking to the deeper past where Greek civilization has yet to appear. This will see us looking back some tens of thousands of years before the rise of Greek culture, where stories that we find familiar in Greek mythology were also present. Bernie Taylor will take us back these tens of thousands of years to a cave site in the Iberian Peninsula, or modern-day Spain. In our talk, Bernie took me on a fascinating journey of his research and the ideas he has developed. I found this turned into a great discussion and hope you will enjoy the episode as much as I did engaging with Bernie. A lot of what we talked about is very visual, so I have provided a number of pictures on the episode page over at the Casting Through Ancient Greece website, while I've also provided Bernie Taylor's links, where you'll be able to find even more resources. Anyway, I hope you enjoy the next couple of hours. Hello everyone and welcome back to Casting Through Ancient Greece for this interview episode. Today we're going to look at a subject more in depth than the usual Greek history narrative we follow with the series and other interviews I've done. We'll be looking closer at Greek myth, but not so much the stories, but their potential origins and how these ancient stories were far more ancient than the Greeks themselves may have realised. Today I'm joined by Bernie Taylor, naturalist, archaeoastronomer, and author of Before Orion. The research in Before Orion is going to be our main topic for our talk today. Bernie has presented his work to many different audiences, including the European Society for Astronomy and Culture and the American Anthropological Association, to name but a couple. Like I said, he has authored the book Before Orion, and where he has compiled and presented his research. Thank you, Bernie, for coming on the show and to talk about your work today.
Well, Mark, thank you. I'm a fan of your program. You've had some really great guests, interesting stuff. And as you sort of mentioned this, I'm peripheral to Greek history because when we look at Greek history, we're looking at the timeline on your webpage, which I loved it, by the way. And you go back to prehistory through the archaic period, which would, archaic, the most recent part of the archaic period would be Homer. So, but just like in Australia and the United States, we have a history and we look back to our ancestors and we look back to the Greeks and we look to the Romans and we look to the Egyptians and so forth. Well, these people, the ancient Greeks, they had their own history. We think of the history as the Egyptians. But truly their history was in the records, the archaeology that they dug up or the caves that they walk into. They saw a history that was before their time. And when I looked at your write-up on your webpage, I think the key part of this history is 329 BC to 323 BC, when Macedonians and Alexander the Great open up Greece. That is the key period, because during that time period, the Greeks traveled to Egypt. What we now say ancient Egypt was almost contemporaneous to that, but it was relative to us. And when they traveled to ancient Egypt, we have the names of Plato, of course, who met with Solon in a famous story that we've all heard. But we also have another ancient Greek. And if I pronounce the words, because they're Greek to me, you have to correct me. Xenopius of Memphis, who was contemporary of Plato and traveled to ancient Egypt as well. And And actually, I'm sorry, Eudoxus. Eudoxus traveled to ancient Egypt where he met Canopius of Memphis. And Eudoxus was a contemporary of Plato. Plato walked away with his story of a lost civilization that did all these amazing things. And Eudoxus walked away with something else. He walked away with an astronomical history that all of a sudden opened up in ancient Greece, the Greeks of a world that was before their time. The ancient Greeks had constellations, but there's many constellations that just suddenly came on the board when Eudoxus comes back from Egypt. And so the ancient Egyptians were clearly an earlier source. We can go back further in time to see that these constellations existed before the ancient Greeks, before the ancient Egyptians, tens of thousands of years before their time. So that these ancient peoples were mining from prehistoric peoples. They were mining their astronomy, they're mining their art and their mythology, and they lifted their culture without giving credit to it.
Yep.
And that's not the story that we usually hear from the ancient Greeks, because we think of the ancient Greeks as people who left us the world. They left us mathematics, they left us art, they left us poetry, they left us mechanical devices, things that we say the ancient Greeks were the epitome of the modern world, of the ancient times, but they drew from much earlier sources. Of course, there was language before Greeks, and there was language before the Egyptians, and there was language before them. But what did these people speak about? What did they look at the night skies, and what myths did they pass on? And that's where I step in. And I didn't start with the Greeks. I started in the other direction with Upper Paleolithic cave art. And there are recognizable images, not just recognizable images, but in the same order as the Greeks recorded them.
Yeah.
And that's the key, the whole thing.
Yeah. And I think that's one thing. Once you do start reading or learning about different mythologies and stories that are found within different cultures, you start seeing common threads that seem to borrow from one another, but then you start to wonder, well, where did these originate from? Where did they come from? There's obviously a source to these stories elsewhere.
Exactly. And archaeologists and anthropologists really struggle with this question, because there's clearly dispersal of myths and let's say archetypal characters around the world. And so, you look at the History Channel or these on TV, you'll find ancient aliens, you'll find Atlanteans, you'll find all these sort of things. In archaeologists, we don't have the evidence. First, they don't believe in Atlantean stuff. They don't believe in the ancient alien stuff, and neither do I. But their problem is, well, how do we explain this? How do we explain these people that have all these concepts all around the world? And one avenue to explain them is that we have we're wired similarly. So as Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung talked about, this journey to hero. And so we have common stories. The hero goes, he says, no, I don't want to do this. He steps through the threshold. He begins his journey. He's his trials and tribulations. He finds the grail of sorts. He battles the demon, and he comes back and tells the story. And so we have these common stories around the world, but what's different is that we have common characters, both terrestrial characters, underworld characters, and in the night sky. And we find them around the world. And so archaeologists and anthropologists, they really struggle with this question. They very easily, push off, the Atlantis and the ancient alien sort of stuff. Because that's known as hyperdiffusion, that ideas diffuse fairly quickly. They struggle with the idea of diffusion because how do you connect people in Australia who observe the constellation Orion? And the constellation Orion is chasing women, which is the same story as the Greeks have, okay, and as people in Siberia have. How do you have these same stories around the world? It suggests that there's a really early source of mythology, and not just these archetypal characters, the hero on his journey, because these are very specific characters, especially the story we have of Orion, who chases the girls, the women. And so what I've done is I've looked back in time to about 40,000 years ago, and I was looking for something completely different. I was interested in the biological clocks of animals. Okay. And I was looking at how they relate the biological clocks between animals as posted on or depicted on Paleolithic caves in Europe are similar to that of Native Americans in my neck of the woods here in Oregon. Because in Oregon, we have all these calendars and they have all these characters, all these animals, and they depict seasonality, specific biological events and things like that. And so I said, well, if Native Americans had this technology or this knowledge, biological knowledge, then why wouldn't people in Upper Paleolithic Europe have it as well? Both hunter-gatherers lived fairly similar lives, and lo and behold, they had it. They have very similar calendars depicted. Most of the animals depicted in Upper Paleolithic cave art are animals that are part of their calendar, okay, as opposed to something they're just hunted. In fact, good majority of the animals in cave art are females, and they're pregnant. And I'm not sure how much hunting you've done in Australia, but no one hunts pregnant female animals. It's just not a thing. So that's where I started. And I started working on that about 20 years ago. And I wrote Biological Time, a number of peer-reviewed papers, did a lot of presentations. And I put it on the shelf while the concept was, disseminating out there. And I said, I'm going to come back in 10 years. 10 years I came back, and there was older dated art. And I went back and looked at the exact same. I'll start counting the dots. How do they relate to the animals? And can I find the same biological time concept earlier? And I started looking at an image, and I said, well, that kind of looks like an elephant. So I contacted someone I'd met in my mid-20s. I'm 56 now. And his name is George Schaller. And George Schaller was the mentor of Jane Goodall and many others of that time period. So when you go to George Schaller and you ask him a question, it's sort of like, going to Tiger Woods and saying, how's my golf stroke? And Tiger can say, maybe you stick the putt-putt, or you just need a little more practice before you go to the pros. And I met George when I lived in China in my mid-20s, and I met him in an event related to Chamber of Commerce. And so he didn't remember me, but of course I remembered him. And he said to me, let me think about this. And then I saw another image. I said, that looks like a lion. And George just happened to be wrote the first book on lions, biology book on lions at the Serengeti. And he looked at that and he says, that's interesting. Well, we went through, for about a year and a half, we went through images. And we ultimately recognized that there are images of animals in the Iberian Peninsula, now Spain, and in West North Africa, which made it interesting, really interesting. And we saw the giraffe. And he was like, okay, that's the point. Because there were lions in Africa and Iberian Peninsula and many other animals that between the two, but it was the giraffe that really said, okay, we've decided this is now West North Africa. So we have a character that goes on a journey. He starts in the northern part of Iberian Peninsula where this cave is, El Castillo, and he travels, encounters all these animals along the way. He swims across Strait of Gibraltar, it's only about a 3-hour swim. And he travels through West North Africa into the mountainous area. And we can see all the places he goes by the animals that are indigenous to the area and also top geographical features. And then he goes back again, of course. And when he does this, he's looking at the night sky. And all the animals that he sees are the same ones that he sees in the night sky as constellations are the same ones he sees in the terrestrial environment. So the lion is, of course, Leo. Right? And so he goes from north to south and south to north back again and travels by the stars. Well, some of those constellations are where it gets interesting because some of those constellations, for example, that he sees are Pisces as a dolphin or a whale, and Cetus as a sea monster with Paleolithic disorder as a seal, Cygnus as a bird, Draco as a crocodile. Now, these constellations didn't exist in the Greek record until Eudoxus went to Memphis, met Chinopius, and brought them back. Okay, so that's the key element. And time is, and of course, nobody wrote this. They didn't write this down. They just came back. We have this knowledge, and we are now the Greeks.
Yep.
We are brilliant. Whereas the Egyptian priests, they didn't write down anything. That was their tradition.
Yep.
And so we through these images, we can tie ancient Greece during the time of Alexander the Great, connection to Egypt and to the Upper Paleolithic world.
Yep, and that's obviously, like you said earlier, that's the point where I guess it's known as the Hellenistic period because of Greek culture spreading throughout the known world, and as well as Greek culture spreading throughout the known world, more information is coming back into the Greek world as they discover new areas as well.
Yes.
And that's got to be a big key to it.
So that is the benefit of conquerors, isn't it?
Mm.
You can't say yes to that. You can't say yes to that. Well, not in today's world.
Everything's grey. But yeah, I think before we continue on a bit, I mean, I think that set us up really well for where we're going today. But and I guess you've sort of touched on your background and what got you into looking at this cave art and its connections. But what I'm interested in finding out is naturalist and archaeoastronomer. Could you elaborate on what these titles mean?
Yeah, the naturalist definitely came first. There's archaeoastronomy much later.
Yeah.
I was interested in the biological timing of animals, specifically migrating salmon. And in the world of any migrating fish or birds, they come and go from one year to the next, right? But they actually don't come and go. They come and go together, but they're earlier or later from one year to the next. It's just a thing. And so in the Pacific Northwest where I live, we have salmon. And salmon could be earlier or later in about a 25, 30-day window. And that was a puzzle to fishery biologists who I was working with at the time. And they thought it was the weather, but they no one ever showed that was the weather. Well, the Native Americans had it in their calendars, and they had lunar calendars. And how it turned out is that during the dark nights, the salmon would migrate. And they'd basically stop during the day. And then during the full moon nights, when it's light out, they would stop as well, same as the daytime. And so the moon is out of sync with the sun by about 11 days. And so you'd have hypothetically a migration of the salmon on January 12th one year, and next year would be January 1st. So the reason why the animals are moving back and forth in time on our calendars is they're using a lunar calendar, which set them into these rhythms, biological rhythms. The salmon eat invertebrates, aquatic invertebrates, and zooplankton in the ocean. And those animals also have the same sort of rhythms. By the moon, they go up and down to avoid predators based on the light. And so it's the entire system. It's the absolute entire system. And my work on the biological clocks of salmon then became a protocol or procedural in fishery biology and wildlife biology that you don't need to go every week to go look for salmon to count them for conservation reasons. You know when they're going to be there. You don't need to wait in the river to go when they reach the top of the migration run to capture them and put them, get the eggs. You don't have to wait every week for that. I can tell you within 2 days when they're going to be there. And so that became used in fishery wildlife biology. And I always had a problem. I couldn't figure out something. I couldn't figure out which, hypothetically, if it's a new moon, which new moon do you start on? Because it's going back in time every year. And if Ramadan, the Muslim calendar, just circles back through the year, over time, keeps circling back. So, 10 years ago, Ramadan was in December, and now it might be in March or something. On the Jewish calendar and others of that time period, they reset it every 4 years. And we have mechanisms to reset the calendar in our time. So I couldn't figure out how they did it. And if one could figure that out, you could actually figure out the abundance of animals because they have success rates if they're earlier or later, that sort of stuff. And so I went to the Indian calendars and couldn't see it. What they would do is they reset off another animal. So then you really need to find the first animal, which then reset into the salmon. And it would be an indexing animal from one year to the next. And an entire range of species you would know when to hunt or fish and gather. And so that set me back that's when I entered the cave art to figure out, well, maybe they know how to do it. And the answer is they had the exact same answer as the Native Americans, is that there is no way to figure out how to reset it in a kind of a mechanical way. That what they do is they look at an early season animal. It could be typically migrating birds or butterflies. And then we'd say 1 month after the butterfly arrives, then the salmon would arrive. Or 1 month after the swallow arrived, or actually 3 or 4 days after the swallow arrived where I live, then you'd have the first salmon. So I was interested in that concept. Basic survival in the world. If you don't have Costco's or refrigeration. Do you have Costco's where you are?
Not Costco's, but we have other
you have other things.
If you don't
have supermarkets, what do? You have to arrive there at the right time. So what people were doing in the very ancient world, not necessarily the prehistoric world, is they were using the sun, the moon, and the stars to find their place in time and space. Because they didn't have all the resources that we have to store foods and the clocks that we use. So we don't need to be at the river, travel, 30 days to the river to be there when the salmon arrive. We have people who net them out in the ocean. They package them up freeze them, and send them to our supermarkets. So the world was very different. And how they saw their world in prehistoric times, and among Native Americans as well, is that this was all sort of divined, okay? Not in the sense of a god gave it to them, but rather the earth, the terrestrial plane, was a mirror of the sky world. So when certain constellations appeared, those animals would appear, or those, the fish in many cases. And so that's how, and they had mythology or stories about that. The ancient Greeks and others, the Mesopotamians, they did the same thing. With Pisces, they did it. And they looked, their Pisces was set up for the timing of migrating fish, which they recognized that Pisces was timed to migrating fish, and they had myths about that. Now, the difference between a Greek myth and an Upper Paleolithic cave art myth is that the mindset is very different between the two. The ancient Greeks were I don't want to say they were warrior people, but they weren't, when they saw a deer walk, pouncing through the woods, it wasn't sister or brother deer. It was the next meal. Mm-hmm. And when they killed that deer, they didn't raise their hot hands to the sky and thank the Constellation for giving them that deer. Whereas in the Paleolithic world, these people were animists at their very core. All the animals were their brothers and sisters. Okay. The rocks and the trees and the mountains were, part of their consciousness. And I would argue it's still part of our consciousness today. And so when the Greeks and the Egyptians and others had gone to these caves and brought back seeing these images that brought them back, they brought Orion back as a great warrior who slayed animals wherever he went. But in the Upper Paleolithic myth, he's a hero. He's just a hero on his journey. And when he encounters animals on his journey, those animals assist him.
Yep.
Very different mindset. So when we think of Greek myths, that is through the mind. That is through the Greek mind. That is not through the originators of the images that form those myths.
Yeah, you've got, I guess when you've got your Upper Paleolithic peoples, it's more like a hunter-gatherer society. It's a very different makeup than what you'd have of the ancient Greeks, who are considered to live in a civilized society that has laws and government, and it's two very different concepts. So when you look at a story, you're going to interpret it through the lens of your own society and culture.
Absolutely. But there's something they did in common is that they recognized what Jung called archetypal characters. Archetypes are, the hero on his journey would be recognizable. The damsel in distress. We all know who the villain is, right?
Yeah.
The mother, the child, the teacher, the apprentice, all that sort of stuff. And there's also inorganic, non-organic archetypes such as mountains and bodies of water. So the Greeks, they recognized the archetypes and they brought them back. So Mount Olympus is a sacred mountain. In the Upper Paleolithic in Spain, there's a number of Chindoki, Pico Penavera. There's a whole bunch of sacred mountains that were important to them. And of course, in West North Africa, where I say they come from, the big mountain is Atlas, which Herodotus talks about. He talks about in his histories too.
Yep.
And there's in the El Castillo Upper Paleolithic image that most of the work I've done is there's an image of Mount Atlas, which is now called Jebel Tobukal. It is the highest mountain in West North Africa. And so not just the animals that they had seen, but there's geological features and formations. They were animists. But the Greeks somehow carried some of that animism, at least the reverence to mountains and bodies of water. They carried it unconsciously with them, because it's the sacred. Well, you have gods on the mountains, throwing thunderbolts at each other or something, right? But there's still gods on the mountain, and they're connecting with the great beyond. So it's a fascinating that they found the animals, they recognized them in the night sky, they put them into their own mythology, they integrated them more into warlike themes, but they still kept some of these sacred archetypes that carry on to this day. Why do you climb mountains? Just a question. Why have you ever climbed a mountain?
To get a good, I guess, survey the area, get a good view of what lays around and take it in.
So you want to travel to the great beyond. You want to see everything, like God, like Zeus, like Hercules and everybody else. And it's something that draws us to these mountains. We sing about it in our songs, we mythologize. And they had those same archetypes within them that they took back to their society. Which is work that Jung did. Jung said that, Swiss psychoanalyst Jung said that people have these archetypes that they recognize around the world, and we can't explain why they dream about them, and why they climb them, and why they sing about them and mythologize, but they do. One of the big ones in Australia is Meru, M-E-R-U. Is that in your part of the woods?
You're going to have to educate me, because I must admit my knowledge of indigenous mythology isn't that deep.
Okay, Meru is, I think it's Meru. It's in Australia, and it has people go up in the morning. It has an orange face and it's a flat top. Very famous mountain in Australia, a sacred mountain where people climb. So we have this concept around the world.
Oh, sorry.
So when
Uluru, is that what you're referring to?
Uluru,
yeah,
that's it. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's it. Uluru, yeah. And Meru is a Hindi. My mistake. But we have these concepts around the world that people have, they all recognize fundamentally the same concept. But the Greeks morphed it to their own psychology. So we have, in the history of mankind, we have ages. We have the Animus of the prehistoric times, and of course North America, pre-Columbia. And then we have, in the Greeks, we have these Bronze Age people that were warriors. And then we had, towards the time of Jesus Christ and so on, we had a sort of a Reformation sort of thing, that everybody wasn't at war with each other. And then there was a renaissance of spirituality, a different sort of spirituality. And then that which is carried somewhat to our modern time.
It's interesting when you're talking about that too. When I've read different parts of Greek mythology, you get the sense that some parts appear to be more ancient than others, and you get a sense of the natural world being more a part of the story, where it's more something is the embodiment of a particular natural thing, rather than the later parts tend to be more humanizing the gods and heroes and whatever else. But I tend to find the ones that appear to be older are more tied up with the natural world, and not so much, Poseidon being this great man who comes out of the sea and whips up storms, but he is the actual storm itself. It's not, you haven't got an actual tangible figure, but he is the storm. He is the earthquake.
Correct. Exactly. Which is a very animist way of seeing the cosmos. Now, I said earlier that the hero goes on his journey, and he connects with all these animals, and that assist him on his journey. Most of those animals are identifiably female. Okay. With one exception, I would say, is the lion, who he battles with. He slays the lion, he gets the pelt, and you know that story, right? It's a Hercules story.
Yep.
Okay. So he connects with all these female animals, but in Greek mythology, of course, Orion kills all the animals as he goes. But in Greek mythology, the heroes, they're assisted by females. Right? The female goddesses come to the assistance of the hero on his journey. And Joseph Campbell wrote about this as a concept, not knowing the Paleolithic part, the origin of this. And people, they thought it was sexist, modern people, I should say it was sexist that the hero is assisted by the female animals. The female characters, the goddesses who assist the hero. But it's part of this journey that the hero, he never leaves his home. He just takes on other female qualities, supportive, nurturing qualities, as he travels on his journey. And we don't usually think of that in terms of Greek mythology, because the female goddess will give the hero an amulet, a sword, or something that is going to help him to slay something, right? Or protect him from something. But the origin of that, which the ancient Greeks understood, was that they transferred the animal goddess to the human goddess, as you mentioned, for the stories. And so that they kind of made it their own into the framework that they can see. Because I just can't imagine a story of who's the hero who walks into Troy, the major hero characters.
In Troy, so you've got Paris, who returns to Troy as a long lost prince.
But not Paris. Okay. So let's say Paris returns to Troy.
Or Hector.
Yeah. So it's Paris. So in that time period, can you imagine Paris returning to Troy with being guided by a she-goat? Of course not. It's just more likely he's going to slay a she-goat than he's going to be guided by a she-goat. But in the upper Paleolithic view of the world, they saw all the animals as other animals. They saw themselves as animals, just their brothers and sisters animals. And that's really not that far an extension for us. Do you have a cat or dog at home?
Yeah, I got a couple of dogs, yeah.
Okay. Have you ever taken a family picture with the dogs?
Yep.
Okay. So it's really not far an extension either. You name your dogs, you talk to your dogs, you listen to your dogs, you feed your dogs. It's not that further step than children. And many people have starter dogs before they have children. That's animism. Okay. And, so there's something within us that we connect close to animals, especially those animals that, for example, dogs, which serve us and protect us in many ways, and give us comfort. So that's animism. So there's something inside of us that allows us to do this. If you look at any comic action hero, they integrate with Spider-Man, integrates the spider, Batman, the bat. You can go on and on. That's animism as well. And we can go to the theater and we can mentally accept these stories with these characters because it's still within us. Okay. And so the Greeks had some confrontation with that concept. Is they stepped away and they said some animals like Pegasus can fly the Bellerophon, the hero, to the mountain, which of course falls off on the way, but he still flies. And Hercules can be trained or tutored by a centaur. They were okay with that stuff, especially with these male animals. But they fully didn't embrace that Hercules, on this hero's journey that he takes in the upper Paleolithic world, Hercules overlaps and transforms with the dolphin to become a merman. Hercules overlaps with the giraffe to become a giraffe man. I don't know. So they weren't ready for that idea. And there's another thing that they didn't have in their mythology is that they said that Hercules, Orion, Perseus, and others were different characters. And sometimes they battled with each other. But in the Upper Paleolithic mythology, this version, the hero, they're all the same hero. They're all the same hero. And as they travel, the hero travels around through the other constellations as he goes on his journey from north to south and back again. He overlaps with these animals, female animals who assist him and then take him back again. There's a psychological difference between the Upper Paleolithic mind and the Greek mind, but there's overlap as well.
So I always thought, well, listening to that as well, you see, obviously the gods more so in Greek mythology turn themselves into animals to come down and interact in the mortal world as well. And perhaps that's one of those overlaps that is occurring there as well.
Oh, clearly. And Zeus transforms an eagle to dive down into the earth, the terrestrial plane. And if you look at Zeus, Aguilar, astronomically, the bird he transforms into is Aguilar, the constellation of the eagle. And what Aguilar does as a constellation is it actually swoops down from left to right in the sky, comes down to the earth, and then goes up again. Yeah. And so that story is actually depicted in the astronomy, and it's depicted in the astronomy of the Paleolithic too. Now Zeus swoops down to steal the boy turns into eagle swoops down to get the boy who becomes his cupbearer. That boy is shown in this image in that same order. In the upper Palaeolithic version of the story, what happens, the shaman swoops down to get the boy, who then helps the boy on his journey. And the shaman is actually shamaness because it's a female character. And who swoops him down? Well, it's the bird, the eagle's a female character, I should say. And the eagle's the female character assists and helps the boy at the beginning of his journey. Now, there's something, we're both familiar with Homer. And we have the Iliad and we have Ulysses. These are completely different books. It's almost like they weren't written by the same author. One is the Siege of Troy and the Battle of Troy. And the other one is Ulysses, who takes is a 12-year journey or something. How could you be lost for 12 years? Mediterranean is not that big. They could, go back and forth. Mediterranean probably in 3 weeks or something. It's just not that big. Now, there's a scene in the Ulysses where he goes to an island. And on an island, which I would actually say is the underworld, he goes to the island and he encounters his children, his dead children. He encounters Hercules. And Hercules talks about his dead children. And he encounters Cepheus. He encounters Cepheus, who's pushing a boulder up the mountain. And he encounters Orion, who's slaying animals on a mountain. Okay. It's the same scene. That is exactly the same scene as we have in this Palaeolithic cave image. So Homer had some source of this image prior to Alexander the Great, because he has it in Ulysses. And it's sort of a strange scene in the Odyssey because it doesn't belong. Why does Ulysses have to go to this island to see all these people that are dead, the underworld? He goes in the world and he comes out again. And that's like sort of what a shaman does. The shaman enters the world of the dead and then he returns to the world of living, having received some sort of benefit. But that doesn't make any sense in that Ulysses story, why he has that it's off track.
Sorry, I wonder too, because he also visits his dead mother in the underworld. So whether that female connection has, because it's supposedly he's off track and then he visits the underworld, and then this is supposedly, well, he gets advice from Siri, who tells him to go to the underworld, and that will enable him to make his way home. And during that visit, he also visits his mother after those heroes as well, and receives prophecy as well, which is like I'm just thinking, it just seems like the female connection to then putting him back on track to get back home.
And not just the female, I believe you're correct on the female connection, but he's also, when you're talking about the underworld, people just didn't like drop through the earth. The underworld are caves.
Yeah.
That's what they're entering. And so absolutely, it's not Greek mentality to go into the underworld to do these sort of things and to see these images, because it just doesn't fit into the mind of the people who just conquered Troy, who sieged the walls and all that sort of stuff. It just doesn't make any sense. And there's another, and the story of Hercules is clearly one. He enters the underworld to get the Cerberus, right?
Yep.
And he goes, he goes to the land of the dead, and he meets all these people who tell him what to do and give him assistance. And then he returns from the underworld. Again, you have this very world of people who had poetry, who made mechanical devices, who had made brilliant weapons of war and highly, militaristic. It just doesn't fit together. And so they're drawing these images from a very deep time that they're trying to make sense of, putting into their own world, but they realize that they can't, they see the hero, the character go into the underworld. They can't erase that part of the story. They see that the character meets the hero meets another character who gives assistance. They switch that from, a giraffe to a female giraffe to a female human. But that's about as far as they can go, because they still have to deal with these images of people entering the underworld and then coming out again. And in the underworld, I would say in some cases they meet spiritual characters. And to go into the underworld with most of these images, they adorn they wear bird-like gear. So they'll wear like a helmet of bird feathers, and it's either some sort of an eagle or a vulture, which are both raptors. And they will have the feathered dress as well. And we see these images in the caves. And so that's another thing that the Greeks probably like, are we ready to go this far? Because we have to sell this to our own people. I mean, they already had centaurs walking down the street. If that's what it looks like in Greek, mythology. And they spoke as the centaurs; they were real. And in some case, in fact, the centaur, when the man dresses up as a bird to go into the cave and in the feather dress, he's actually he overlaps with a horse. In every case, he overlaps with a horse. He becomes a bird centaur, if there is such a thing. But that is certainly the origin of the centaur. The prehistoric people never believed that there were centaurs walking around. What they believed was that you can gain the strength of the centaur by spiritually integrating with that other animal being. Mm. Whereas the Greeks walked away with that, and Chiron teaches basically almost every Greek hero how to throw an axe and a spear, and all the arts of war. So they got some things right, but they had to put it with how does it work for ancient Greek society? Because as far as I know, ancient Greek spiritual leaders weren't dressing up like shaman, putting on a headdress and putting a fake horse around their bellies and trounce around in the streets.
Yeah, it's I guess you see it perhaps not through religious leaders or whatever else with that, but you see perhaps the heroes or other thing taking on those roles. I mean, the most obvious one is Heracles, where he wears the Nemean lion's skin, and I guess is that like it taking on the strength of the lion and that type of concept as well.
Absolutely, 100%. So in the Heracles, Homer spoke about Heracles, but Homer didn't speak of Heracles as a constellation. There's a big difference there. So the character of Heracles or Hercules existed before they showed up in the constellations from Eudoxus. Okay? So 400 years later.
All right. Before we move on, we're going to use the term Heracles and Hercules interchangeably. Well, interchangeably. So we're talking about the same person.
Same guy. We're Heracles. Yeah. And the Hercules, Heracles, and the Nemean lion is important characters in the Paleolithic myth. Because what we have it is the only case that the hero battles with an animal, and the animal is visibly male. It's visibly male. And in this image is really cool because the animal, the hero overlaps with the lower side of the lion. Okay. And the red pelt, which is the blood, right, of the actually it's not the blood of the Nemean, it's the blood of the previous victims of the Nemean lion. Because the Nemean lion goes back to the cave brings all his dead people with him. He's splashed with blood. And so in this image, you have the Nemean lion, which has these red splashes on it, which are the legs of the lion. And the Hercules, the character, the hero character, who's Perseus at this time, but it's really the same character. Perseus is under the legs of the Nemean lion. And if you erase out sort of the Nemean lion, you can see that the red pelt then becomes draped around the hero's neck. So it's almost like it's like animation. Mm-hmm. But it's all possible if you think of the concept of the hero traveling through the sky and overlapping with the constellations. Yeah. It all becomes mentally possible. And
sorry, go ahead.
In Africa, in South Africa, there are tribes that the part of achieving manhood is to go out and slay a lion. And you can't do it with a rifle. You can't kill a wounded lion or a sick lion, it has to be, the man and his spear against the lion, which is not an easy task to do. And what they do afterwards is they take the mane of the lion and bring it back to the village, and the women dress the whole thing up, and he walks around for, the rest of his life having this mane of the lion, so that he then becomes like the ultimate hero. Of course, everybody can't do this because then you have no lions left. It's like a thing. Yep. And so it's the first person who gets the lion is the one who continues on, who gets it. Whereas many boys go out, but only one actually happens per year, every few years. So the tradition is to show your courage against the lion, which goes back to what you were saying before. So in this upper Paleolithic image where the hero encounters a lion, he's challenging the apex predator. And when they overlap, the two overlap, it actually looks as though they're fighting. And that the lion is, of course, on top of the hero, is how it plays out. And you see that image often in Greek mythology, of images of Greek mythology, where the lion is actually pushing the hero down. The hero is Heracles, in most cases. And so they took that back, and with the pelt of the lion.
Tell me, Muse, the story of that resourceful man who was driven to wander far and wide after he had sacked the holy citadel of Troy. This is the opening sentence of the second great work credited to Homer, the Odyssey. It is a tale of wandering and adventure with the hero Odysseus, who is attempting to make his way home to his kingdom of Ithaca, his wife Penelope, and his son Telemachus. In his journey, he would encounter many strange lands and creatures that would provide his quest home with many dangers. Over on Patreon, we are finishing up our 3-part look at the poet Homer. We began with our look at the man himself and what Homeric poetry was, when we then turned to the first epic poem attributed to him, the Iliad. Now we are closing out our look at Homer with the Odyssey, where we'll explore the story and its themes. If you would like to gain access to the full-length episode, plus many other bonus episodes, you can head over to the Casting Through Ancient Greece Patreon page, where you'll also have many other benefits, such as early access, ad-free series episodes, monthly series video updates, reference transcripts, and a personal forum where questions are answered monthly via video. So if you've been enjoying the series, please consider supporting it over on Patreon. Thank you everyone for your support. Let's get back to the episode.
So what I think would be maybe helpful now is, like, we're talking about a lot of the Greek stories and then how they connect to the Paleolithic stories that are in the cave art. But perhaps could you give us, I guess, a general overview of the particular cave that you're talking about and the image, like what's actually in that cave?
Oh, absolutely. Sure. Absolutely.
I think that will then build a bigger picture for us to then
absolutely
keep referring back to.
Sure. Absolutely. And people go to my webpage, beforeorion.com, and there's lots of images there. But so let's talk about this panel. This panel, it's about 10 meters across, and you get meters. And of course, the United States don't get meters. 10 meters across and about 4 meters high. And the initial panel had all kinds of organic material. Okay. So there was no images of anything unless someone imagined something. And then what the artists did was they basically scraped off the entire panel. Okay. And when they scraped it off intentionally, such that they scraped all the organic matter, but they scraped off the limestone, because it's all white. They scraped it into the fin of the dolphin or the back of the hero, something like that. And then they put red and black dots over it. And these red and black dots, they go from one end to the other. And they're absolutely a straight line. Quite interesting. They're a straight line. And I really struggled at what the heck are these dots, because I was trying to count the biological time stuff. And then I ended up going through all these constellations. I still don't know what the red dots mean. I had no actual visualization of what it could be. So you have this panel and you have all these characters that actually overlap each other. And so the heroes overlap with the dolphin, but the dolphin is kind of in that same space as a whale. And so all the Iberian animals on one end, the viewer's right, the aquatic animals in the middle, and the left side, you got all these African animals. So you got a pretty wide screen. And the image that I used was taken by this Spanish artist, Pedro Suarez. He didn't know what he had. he just happened to be standing in the right place when he took this huge 10-meter cross image, which is very difficult to take in a cave. It's actually difficult to take anywhere, to get the lighting correct. So he had multiple light sets when he did this. And I bought the image from him about 6 years ago. He didn't know what he had. And I got a deal. He's not happy. He's not happy at all. Because, well, he thought I would tell him. But if I told him what I had, he never would have let me use it. Because he could have sold it for a lot more money, for sure, at least. So you have this 10-meter long panel. And this cave is in the northern part of Spain, Cantabria. So Bilbao, if people know geographic of cities, it'll be southeast of Bilbao. But we're talking the northern part of Spain. And Monte El Castillo, which Monte means mountain, which has a number of other famous caves in it. And I've continued doing this work in El Castillo because I've aligned myself with another photographer who's been very generous to me. And I've shared the work back and forth. And I found many other similar thematic images. But I've looked at 4 or 5 other caves, and I found the same hero character who wears the headdress, and he overlaps the horse. And time-wise, it ranges from about 34 to 15,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Can you imagine or think about any religion we have today? How far back in time can we chronicle it?
Yeah, you can't even imagine the time span of what's happening in between those times. But how did they date the images on the cave? Is it because of the dots or?
Good question. Actually, that's a really good question. So there's different ways that cave art is dated. One is through if you can have some sort of organic matter like charcoal. But and the difficulty with charcoal dating is that you don't know if that was charcoal someone found in the corner and started to use that came from 10,000 years before. The other way, which is how this one was done, was uranium series dating. And the panel is limestone, and limestone secretes calcium carbonate, which comes out, looks like a little popcorn. And that's a datable substance. And so when the popcorn pops over any of the images, then they can say that image, the popcorn is at least the same age as that image. Okay. But the image could be hundreds or thousands of years earlier than that. But if you get a whole bunch of these popcorn things, or a whole bunch of images, and they're within, a few hundred years of each other, reasonably you can say, we can date this to about 34,000 years ago. Now in the same cave, they have one in another part of the cave. There's one that goes about 40,000 years ago. And that's what struck my interest 6 years ago, because it became the oldest dated art in the world. Since then, we have older by 1,000 years in Indonesia, and I went off in Indonesia. So it's it's in today's technology, it's pretty good. And this technique has only existed for about 10 years now. And so that's how it was done. But they did it off of the red discs. Now, I'm going to go back to these red discs. This is actually interesting. So I struggled with these red discs. And so I actually wrote a book, Before Orion. I still didn't know what the red discs were. I knew they were north or south, and so someone could have used them for orientation. Okay, clearly, because it's a straight line from north to south. And then when I started working on I started separating characters. Like, for example, the hero who's as Perseus and the lion. I separated them apart and said, "Oh my God!" When you separate these apart, you find the major stars as the red discs in each character. And so their storyline was that there was a time in our distant past where all the constellations in the night sky were all together, sort of like before the Big Bang. Okay. And they were overlapping with each other. And then there was a void. And now we're talking Greek, right? There's a void. There's an abyss. And from that abyss, everything came forth. And so what the Greeks did was they got the cosmic egg. Well, you can use as the abyss or the cosmic egg. They got the basic story, as the Upper Palaeolithic cave artists did. Where you have all these constellations and characters that are on top of each other, and then they explode. Now, we still believe that story today. In the 1940s or 1950s or so, Father Lemaitre was a Belgian astronomer priest, and he mathematically came up with the concept of the Big Bang. It was called the Big Bang as a joke, as like a big orgasm. That's the history of it. Einstein, right, says your math is correct, but your physics are atrocious. I don't buy this. So all of the major physicists worldwide did not buy the Matrix story for two reasons. One is they knew it was the cosmic egg story. Okay, the same story that now what I'm saying goes back 34,000 years at least. But the other thing is Pope Pius at that time comes out and he says, now we can prove that there was a creation in the Big Bang. And so for many years there were different physics stories or ideas about the Big Bang. And now it's generally accepted that the Big Bang is a story, unless you're an atheist, an atheist scientist. Atheist scientists came out, and I'm not saying that in a bad way. Okay? The atheist scientists came out with the concept of the multiverse because they didn't like the Big Bang story because they said smell the religion and the cosmic egg story. And Lemaitre he himself said, I've envisioned this through the cosmic egg. And so the modern multiverse story, or modern multiverse science, one should say, is a counter to the Big Bang story. And so we're still telling ourselves all these Paleolithic myths because we're stuck with these archetypal characters. We don't have the ability to think out of this matrix that we live in. We can't think out of a box because we can't experience things out of those boxes. And so we carry our mythologies and we move them forward within this archetypal box. And so whether out there in podcast land, whether you're a Big Banger or you're a multiverse or, with Marvel comics and the rest of it, you got to look back. You have to see, where do these stories come from? And in the case of the cosmic egg or the void from where everything came, the underworld, that's an upper Paleolithic story. And we can clearly see it, in the image because we have all these constellations that are on top of each other, they overlap with each other. And then they when you separate those red discs, they become, the night sky with all the stars. And I gave many I wrote the book, I gave a lot of presentations. Everybody asked me the question, what are the red discs? What are the red discs? And it took me like 3 years to figure out. It's when I started taking apart the constellations, then I can see that both the red discs and these black discs, and each red disc is about the size of the palm of your hand, they became the stars themselves. And that sort of, I'm continuing on this journey, because every few months, I go deeper into it to another level and I say, wow, that's what that is. And I've since gone to many other caves and found the same themes.
Is that the red disc too, being in a straight line? Does that represent like the elliptical that you look out onto? Because that's where you tend to find all your major.
Good question. That's a very good question. So the answer is I don't know. And I don't know because to work, I'd have to separate 40 constellations to do that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a huge job. And the answer is, I don't know, but I don't think so because it appears to have some constellations that are pretty far off the elliptical grid. Okay. But as clearly as you would see them, and people can go to my slideshows, and I actually, I use Starry Night Pro 8, which is same software planetariums use, and I lay them out. I mean, actually, the software lays them out, and you can see them in the same order as they are in the cave. And so, because that's where they come from.
Yeah. And just for everyone listening too, I'm definitely going to be putting up a lot of images of this cave art as well, so you can actually see what we're talking about and bring it up while we're even talking at the moment. And also visit Bernie's site at Before Orion, where you get a lot of resources too. But it is, I was taken, I don't know how to explain it, but you see the cave when I first looked at your work, and I must admit, I recognized the dolphin straight away. And then when I was watching some of your presentations, it was very interesting how, I guess, intricate the work is when you can find one image and then you sort of shift your focus a little bit, and then all of a sudden another image emerges from that part of that same image, but creates a new one. And it just sort of follows all the way around the line of discs.
Yeah. So when I told you, I mentioned earlier that I sent out to George and for the lion and the what was the other animal? Anyway, so when I sent that to George, I thought, I've got it. I've got the whole thing right now. And it was almost like every other day, I say, I'm done. But then there'll be another one. I did that for about 2 years. And I'm still doing it. That these images are still popping out because how the artist did them is that they overlap with each other. And so first you see the man, then you see the dolphin, you eventually see the dolphin. And then you see, well, they actually overlap with each other. Or in the case of the hero is overlapping with the lion. And this is what I believe. Okay. I can't prove this one way or the other. I believe that these Upper Paleolithic cave artists were extraordinarily brilliant. I mean, artistically beyond what we could actually imagine. And that they made these images so that to see one, you had to see the other. Okay. That they actually unfold like animation. I believe that they did it because that's the way that I ultimately saw it. And so I think that there's a genetic component to this. Okay? In our modern world, if you're going to be an astrophysicist or if you're going to be an engineer, a software engineer, you have your parents. One of your parents was probably pretty high in the math level in their education, and they're probably a college professor or something like that, or maybe a professional engineer. And if your parents were, your dad was a professional ball player, you probably got some talent in you. And you think, Pele, his father was a professional soccer player, and Mickey Mantle's father was a professional ball player. But you find these things in the genetics. You find these things with art as well. Picasso's father was an artist. He's not only did he had the being taught at an early age technique and form, but he had that visual ability to see things as most of us don't see them. Okay. It's just the way what it is. And so I think that there was a time period in our distant past where there was a greater inheritability of certain genes for visual expression. Okay. And visual expression could be watching the night sky and chronicling the stars. It could be to do this sort of work on the cave walls. And on these caves walls, we have to remember that if you don't get it right once, it's done. Because you can't put the limestone back on the wall to make it happen. So they had to see, like Michelangelo, Da Vinci saw Michelangelo in the marble before he actually, did the first chisel. That's what someone says anyway. They had to see the vision in the rock first, in that rock wall, and then started chiseling away to make it happen. And limestone is very easy to chisel. It's like your fingernail, hardness level. So I think that they were transferring this, not just knowledge technique, but also the ability to have this knowledge and technique genetically. And it's not that far fetched. If you want your kid to be, your daughter to be a basketball player, go marry a 7-foot woman. That's how you do it. It's not by, randomly picking up the gene pool, the loveliest lady you saw at a bar. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah. And I think, another part, I guess, too, that helps highlight how this information is being recorded and passed on and the stories within, I feel like it really comes down to, again, the society that you're growing up in as well, because nowadays it's harder for us to understand these stories and their deeper meanings because we have writing, we convey the written word to get information across. But in these older times, you didn't have writing. No one was literate. You had to find other ways to capitalize the messages and information that could then be immortalized and passed on through generations. And I guess that's what you tend to find in this art as well, is these stories are being preserved for future generations as well.
Exactly. One of the dominant images in Upper Paleolithic cave art is a pregnant mare. I mean, it might be like 20% of all images have this pregnant mare. Well, pregnant, I'm not sure if you're a horse person or, vet the family or something. Okay. So these images of the pregnant mare are in April time period. Okay. So it's telling us a time and a place. Okay. And so there's probably some mythology tied to the pregnant mare. it's not at random. It's not just a fat horse. It's not a bloated horse. It's certainly not a male horse. They're telling you that at this time and place, in this season, that's when you see the pregnant mare. And so the pregnant mare is, I believe, is also part of the calendar, because after the pregnant mare becomes, she drops in May. The next animal will drop is the ibex, and the one after that is either the auroch or the bison. And so the pregnant mare is kicking off is the indexing animal to kick off the calendar for the rest of the year. And just like we would say Christmas is, you have to, you get a present, you need to buy the goose or shoot the goose or whatever you do in Australia. There's a whole sequence of events, ideas, and activities that happen around Christmas. Well, the same thing would have happened around the pregnant mare. She dropping her young, is they need to be in a certain time and place to see this. They needed to, what were they going to eat when they get there? Because they weren't going to eat the pregnant mare, that's for sure. And so they had to have, it was part of their life. It was their Christmas to say, this is, all these events happen around this. So there's deeper meaning. And then they find this pregnant mare, they have this pregnant mare in the underworld, they have it in the terrestrial plane, and they also have it in the night sky. And so also they have it in mountains too, as a separate issue. But the transcendental moment is the connection between these three realms. And then they become one with what we would say today is, the divine, the great mystery, the great almighty. That becomes, and when the cosmos, not just speaks to them, but they are, we are one sort of thing. The things that we like when people go to churches, they say, out of rote, but these people, they lived it. They saw it, and it was their cosmos.
And this goes back to your, I guess, the naturalist connection, isn't it? Where people were much more in tune with the natural world to be able to run their lives and their societies, whereas today we're just look at the calendar to see what day it is.
Exactly. We go to the supermarket.
Yeah.
So years ago, after I wrote Biological Time, I went to all the tribes in the Pacific North Columbia Basin. So that's about 5 tribes here, major tribes. And I gave presentations to tribal counselors. I taught at their schools, and I gained some level of trust. And I was introduced to what a tribal leader. And this person, and everybody in this region, they all know who he is because he runs all the ceremonies. And he had it, he's the apprentice. And so his uncle trained him. And his brother was actually the one who's supposed to be in line, but his brother didn't want to get up early enough to do the stuff and wasn't really interested. He can go back through his uncles for many, many generations. So we're talking hundreds of years ago. He can name them. And every morning, we're talking every morning, I'm not just saying Christmas or New Year's, every morning he gets up before dawn and he goes out and he looks at the night sky and he watches the stars. And he's been doing this since he's a little kid. And now he's about late 40s, maybe early 50s. And he looks at the stars and he watches for the stars that rise. And the stars that rise are his calendar. And they tell him what's going to happen in his world and what to prepare for. And I believe the Upper Paleolithic image cave artists were doing the exact same thing. So it's the first rising of the star. And this might be, the Sirius, the dog star. They saw that was a dog too, by the way. And they would say that, we have a story about this star and now we need to go do something. They also had a lunar calendar. So they were resetting that lunar calendar to the stars. And so what he believed was that truly believed that the stars were telling him what was going to happen telling what happened in this terrestrial world. Direct connection between the two. Yeah. It's not a calendar. He truly believed that the two were connected because that's what goes back in his lineage of spiritual leaders for hundreds of years, pre Lewis and Clark. And having spent that time with him, I realized I came to a lot of realizations. One is that we're not just retelling out the same stories, but just when someone says to me, well, how can we, a hypothetical archaeologist, how can we truthfully know about it? Well, it's because there are people that know about these things, that people have been carrying these on for generations since time immemorial, as the Native Americans would say. And from him, I learned this, I found this deep connection. So in astronomy, we have what's called a star chart. And it's a wheel that goes around and you can turn it for each date. And then each date you can see the stars in the night sky. I gave him my star chart. And I broke like the card, Star Trek is a cardinal directive. And the cardinal directive in Star Trek is you're never supposed to tell a more primitive society about your technology because they're supposed to learn it for themselves.
Yep.
And the truth was that it was in reverse. He had the higher technology because when he was connecting with those stars in the night sky, he was also connecting to the wind and the weather and the animals in his environment. So everything was tied in his world, cosmically tied to the stars and the moon and the sun that would rise. And so maybe he broke the prime directive on me, because it wasn't the star chart is what you look at, at home to plan to see what's going on in the night sky. It has no relevance to the cosmos, which includes this terrestrial plane around us. And so I learned, and years later, I ran to a woman. I can't remember what it was at an event, and she says, the Indians think you're spooky. First, actually, she says, you're Bernie Taylor. I know you. And I'm like, okay, what did I do? And she says, the Indians think you're spooky. And she said that you know things that they don't know. And what it was I had made all these biological connections with the salmon and the deer and the elk and all this sort of stuff. And I showed how it works statistically. From their perspective, it was in their mythology, it was in their hunter-gathering practice. It's what you did based on the sun, the moon, and the stars. They had never made that biological. They never saw it as biological. They thought it was a connection to the great beyond. And so they thought I was spooky that I made those connections.
Now, one thing I wanted to maybe flesh out a little bit was, I guess a lot of people will look up in the sky at the constellations and go, how do you see a line there? Or how do you get a particular image from certain constellations? Is that because of a connection? I guess when you look at the cave art, is that a particular time of the year, a series of stars will then align with what's happening in the natural world on the Earth? So
this is what they would do. So every day a star will rise on the horizon you didn't see the day before.
Yep.
So what the Native Americans did, and I believe the Palaeolithic cave artists is that they were looking for this first sighting of a star because it didn't happen before. It's sort of like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. You're on Tuesday and Monday was yesterday. So they had a star for Monday and a star for Tuesday, except they didn't have weeks that, rotated every 7 days, but they had it, 365 days.
Yep.
And so it's the first star that appears. It's the heliacal rising of the star. And if you have a whole bunch of stars that make a constellation, it would be the last star that rises, and it would be the heliacal rising of that constellation. And so that's how it's done. If you look up into the night sky, you really can't say one day for the next because it's up in the night sky. Maybe relative to a mountain or something, but it has to be that first rising of the star. And then the last in that specific constellation that makes it the heliacal rising. Now, you said something very interesting. I give my primary audience for my programming is to astronomers, professional astronomers, people who, look for killer comets and stuff, right?
Yep.
I've never done a presentation that they didn't say the same. Someone didn't come up quietly and whisper to me and say the same thing, saying, I don't see the constellations. Okay. And what it is if you're doing high level astronomy, looking for killer comets and solar flares and stuff, it's all math. You're on that end of the spectrum, the engineer. You're not on the astronomer visual end of the spectrum. They're different people. They're different genetics. And so I'm obviously clearly on the, on this artist side of the spectrum. And so they struggle with that idea that, they can do with their equipment, they can see the constellations, but they visually can't see it because it's just lights. And that's that genetic connection that, the modern astronomer today does brilliant work, important work, killer comets, right? We got to watch out for those things. But what the Paleolithic artist and my friend, the spiritual leader, was doing is they had to see their entire tribe, depended on them being able to see the stars and then connecting the dots and having a mythology that they could tell about them. That's a very different skill set and inherited gene set than the person who's looking for killer comets.
Yeah. And would
asteroids, more asteroids,
yeah.
Meteorites, yeah.
And would the images that they see, would that be because what they actually see in the sky, or would it be because those series of stars that have risen would associate with something important in the natural world, whether it be that it's a season for a particular type of animal or whatever else?
So that's half of it. The other half of it is that, so there's, when people, often people, when they have strokes, they lose their ability to see pareidolia. So constellations of pareidolia, there's no bear in the night sky, and there's no horses, and there's none of this stuff. It's all pareidolia. And so pareidolia is the ability to see things that are not there by creating from the dots, creating recognizable patterns. That's pareidolia. Okay. And so there's people who can't see any pareidolia. If they look at the clouds, they don't see bunnies, and they don't see elephants, and they don't see horses' heads. And these high end of astronomy, physics, they don't see bunnies in the clouds. It's not that they don't want to see bunnies; they can't see them. Whereas these upper Paleolithic cave artists, they were pretty high in the bunny scale. And so there was a time in our past, pre-Greek, because the Greeks became engineers, right? By their time.
Yep.
And what was important to the ancient Greeks was not to see bunnies in the sky, but rather how can they wage war and build instruments and be poets and stuff as well, and have organized society. People who run organized societies are not the people who see elephants in the clouds. But then people come along over time, the Disneys, the Spielbergs, these highly visual people who bring it back to us, and they have in their genes. And we're amazed by what they can do. But perhaps there was a time in our distant past when most people could do this. Mm-hmm. And we were weeding out the people who could count to 20, more than their fingers, more than 12 lunations. I think that's ultimately what happened. And my friend, there's clearly, they were going through the uncle line, to keep those genes that he could have those abilities. So why do you have the uncle? You always know who the mother is. Okay? You never know who the father is. I mean, people say I know my father. The fact of the matter is, 23andMe test will tell you that person is not your father. And you always know who the mother is. And so if you go through your uncle as being the mentor to carry it through, you carry that lineage. Mm. Don't ever say it to your parents that I said that.
No, yeah, it's interesting, and just trying to just build that, I guess, connection too, especially when in this show we're more along the lines of, the Greek narrative and what's in the historical record, but trying to wrap our heads around, I guess, bigger concepts that exist that are outside of the written word as well. So it's interesting to see how these ideas came about.
It's the unconscious thought.
Mm.
Yeah. So I took. Yeah, sorry.
No, go ahead. I was just going to say, because I know the cave art that you've been studying supposedly tells perhaps a story as well, mm-hmm. I guess. And we keep coming back to the hero's journey, mm-hmm. and we brought it up a few times. But I thought we could perhaps look at the story that's in this the cave art that you've been looking at. But before could we maybe look at, I guess, one of the more famous works that I guess has made the concept of the hero's journey, I guess, more recognizable to us through Joseph Campbell's work, The Hero of a Thousand Faces? Because I think that's where you find the concept all brought together from the various societies, and then even the particular archetypes that are found throughout all different myths that all tie together as well.
Absolutely. And Joseph Campbell was a disciple of Carl Jung. Mm. That's where he got much. Joseph Campbell's strength was he went to Europe, and when he was in Europe, he went to conferences, and he brought back the European mindset of these ideas, and he brought it back to America, wrote books, and became very famous. And kudos to Joseph Campbell for that, because otherwise we wouldn't have had it. Kudos to him. And so there's in this Upper Paleolithic myth, we have this hero. We're going to say he starts at the right, the viewer's right of the panel. Okay, I can tell you what it is. He starts in northern Iberian Peninsula, and we have this boy, and the boy is he overlaps with an eagle that sets him off on this journey. And the eagle is in a mid-June time period based on the size of the eagle, because we can actually, we can look at the plumage and that sort of stuff, and we can determine biologically what time period this is. And so the boy sets off his journey in the mid-June time period, and he overlaps with the actually at that point he doesn't overlap to the horse to the end, but he sets off and he goes south and he encounters this giant crab, and of course the giant crab we find is Cornicos in the Greek mythology. Becomes a constellation, Cornicos, and then he encounters the dolphin, and the dolphin carries him across the Strait of Gibraltar, and in one direction, and then he encounters some other animals as well, but he lands on the Strait of Gibraltar on the other side of the western North Africa, and he sees a woman, and the woman becomes the constellation Andromeda. But in that same place, so he encounters the woman is also the mountain Jebel Musa. Jebel Musa is on the south side of the Strait of Gibraltar, and it's identical replica to the cave image of the woman who's Andromeda. And so the cave artist, is seeing pareidolia in the mountains that he says these are geographic points that are not just lines in the sand, but I now project this character into the night sky. And one of the reasons why people can't see characters of the constellations, because they're almost like you can't recognize, even if you're really high in the pareidolia scale, and even if you study the constellations, it's really tough because the constellations were not first drawn to be horses, women, and all these things. They were found in the terrestrial plane. Okay, so they were first not intended to be constellations. They were projected from the terrestrial plane into the night sky, and people and the ancient Paleolithic people, they found the stars as they could best fit the whole thing together. Okay. So then he meets the character who becomes Andromeda. And in Greek mythology, the story is slightly changed that the Delphinus swims to Andromeda, or the woman who is a daughter of Atlas, to plead the case of Poseidon. So the Greeks changed that story. So he goes into Africa. The hero goes to West North Africa, encounters the giraffe, and encounters a Barbary ape. And the Barbary ape's a significant character because the Barbary ape is indigenous to the Atlas Mountains of West North Africa. We don't find Barbary apes anywhere else. And so the character is now climbing Mount Atlas, Jebel Tobakal, the mountains of the gods. In Herodotus, in his book 2, The Histories, he talks about the Orion being the father. Actually, he talks about the astronomy being founded at Atlas, and that people see this as they revere the mountain as a god. He also said they never ate a living thing. Yeah. And where Herodotus points to is the same place as Mount Atlas is on the map. So the hero climbs Mount Atlas, and then he sees pareidolia in the mountain. That's really important. So a lot of this pareidolia in the mountain, he then become his constellations. Many of the constellations they're from the mountains that he travels and he sees along the way. And there was a Phoenician, Sanchionaphon or something like that, Sanchionaphon, who lived long before Herodotus. And he said that a Phoenician, of course, a Phoenician named Orion, traveled to Mount Atlas, okay, and he invented astronomy there. Okay? So that's how the Phoenicians. Mm-hmm. So this story goes way back before Herodotus. Yep. So the hero he climbs to the mountain next to Jebel Tobakal or Mount Atlas, and he looks and he sees this vision because he can't go on top of the mountain and see the vision of the pareidolia in the mountain. Okay, he then goes down the mountain and he encounters the Barbary lion. Because it's a Barbary lion. It's not just a lion. And he battles with the lion. He faces his fears. And then he meets other animals. And then he goes back to the Strait of Gibraltar and he encounters the lion. The whale. And the hero then travels back across the Strait of Gibraltar in the opposite direction that he went with the dolphin in the belly of the whale, which is of course a story that we've seen before. Mm-hmm. And we see the hero, his head in the belly of the whale. That's how the artist did it. So the whale gives him strength. And there was something very interesting about that. I've said that the Pisces is the is the dolphin. Well, Pisces is also the whale. So how they had two sets of constellations. If you went south, you followed Pisces, and when you went north, you put Pisces at the dolphin, and if you went north, you followed Pisces as the whale in the opposite direction.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, it's fast, and so and then he follows other animals to get him back, including he becomes the spiritual leaders when he returns, and at that point he merges with the horse, which is Pegasus. Two separate characters that merge together, become a centaur, and then they pick up the wings of the eagle and they become Sagittarius. Okay. And that all makes sense because they're all together. The story is in one cosmic egg that is yet to explode, and that's why the constellations are that way. So the IAU, with International Astronomical Union, it was about 40 years ago. They went through all the constellations, and because prior to that time, the constellation characters actually overlapped. And that's how we received them from the ancient Greeks. Now, so they separated them into, quadrangles and polygons and things like that. And so there's no overlap in the constellations because in modern astronomy, we would say that, the fourth star in Hercules is where we're going to point our satellite or something. Okay? Or we're going to look for, aliens, that sort of stuff. And so you can't have more than one star in more than one constellation because they're actually designated by the constellations. So the constellations that we use today that we see are not the constellations from the ancient Greeks. They have been warped, in a space sort of words. And the constellations that we get from Ptolemy, the ancient Greeks, they didn't tell us. They told us that this star is a leg and this star is an arm and this star is an eye. They didn't draw them out as we have them today. And that gave them the flexibility that because as stars move away, they separate. Okay. And it gave them the flexibility that the legs could be further apart in the Archetypes constellations, but they can be closer together hypothetically for the Greeks.
Yeah. Okay.
And so the constellations are always moving. You're not going to find, the legs switched like in Orion. But you will find the stars that are closest to us will see them move the most. But so the night sky, as we envision it, when you look in a book of astronomy or a star chart, as I was doing it, is not the same night sky as ancient Greeks had, the same constellation, and certainly not the same constellations as the Upper Palaeolithic cave images 30,000 plus years before then. And my friend, the spiritual Indian spiritual guy, he had in his tradition about stars that moved. And he talked about this star has moved over time, that it used to be over there. We call this the wandering something or whatever in their mythology. But they recognize that the stars that are the stars that are closest to us move the furthest in the shortest amount of time. But he had his tradition was old enough that they could actually recognize that. And one of the constellations is important is Orion chases the women in the seven women. In 3,000 years ago, there were seven women, and that's where we have this myth in this constellation. But in today's world, we can only see six, and that's both the case in Australian and North American Indians and in the ancient Greeks. And so we can say that this story, this myth, is as old as this time because it had those. You could see all seven of those stars. Yeah. And it's the Pleiades, the women, the women of the Pleiades. So you have seven. Indigenous people in Australia have seven, whereas you can only see six today. But Native Americans also have the seven, which suggests not only that they come from some common root, but the star disappeared.
Mm. Yeah, they were seeing the same sky at a certain point, but then obviously something's changed in the sky.
Something changed, and they kept that in mythology. So you can look at my effectively star chart that I made in the Paleolithic cave images, and if you look north towards Hercules and south turn your head south towards Orion, and you learn the story, you can close your eyes and you can follow the constellations around without even seeing them.
Yeah.
So it's a mnemonic tool to do this. And then it's reinforced by when this hero went on his journey to West North Africa and back again, It was reinforced by the geography of the area as well as the animals in that geography.
Yeah, that's what another interesting thing I found was how that panel, you can associate a story based off of different locations, based off what's in that panel, because not everything not every animal that is in that panel is in that location in Spain. Like you said, you have to travel to North Africa to actually.
Exactly. Yeah. Now here's so people say, well, how do we know that? Well, we have records of Native Americans doing it today. For the Lakota Sioux, which is in let's say the Midwest, they had there was a clan or a group within the Lakota Sioux, and they would travel around the Black Hills, and from the spring until the winter solstice, and every place they stopped would be a mountain, and every mountain they associated with a star pattern constellation. Okay. The last mountain and star pattern that they stopped at was what we call Devil's Tower. I'm sorry, Devil's Tower, what they call Bear Lodge. They don't like Devil's Tower. There's nothing with devils. Anyway, it's Bear Lodge. And at Bear Lodge, they would have their summer solstice ceremony, which they'd have the Sundance where someone would be strapped to a pole and, for a few days, and people would dance around also in pain. And, it was a spiritual experience. Now, what's really cool so that's the same thing this upper Paleolithic people were doing. What's really cool about the story is that most of us know Devil's Tower from the Spielberg movie Close Encounters. Okay. Where they go to they climb Devil's Tower to the top to reach the aliens to transport to the great beyond. That is exactly what the Lakota Sioux were doing without the aliens. They saw that spiritual connection between Gemini, the constellation Gemini, which is a cylinder shape, with two eyes, right? And the twins, and the mountain of Devil's Tower, or for them, Bear Lodge. They look the same, and they found on the same horizon at this time of year, and they had their ascension ceremony. So we still do this today. I live in the Pacific Northwest here, outside of Portland, Oregon, and we have a lot of pareidolia of places from Native Americans, because the Native Americans, their traditions were recorded 60, 70 years ago. And so in all these names, we have a rooster rock because it sort of looks like a rooster, and that's where it comes from. We have three mountains that two are male. They were battling each other, and they threw rocks at each other, and those are two volcanic mountains. So of course they're throwing the rocks and they're fighting over a woman. So that we have this same concept of the earth, the sky, and the mountains and the terrestrial, the whole thing together, packaged with Native Americans in our current mythology stories and signposts everywhere that we have this. And you've got the same stuff in Australia, because I don't. Uluru was one of them. Yeah. It's part of what makes us human. In fact, it may be what makes us human. Our ability to recognize, as far as we know, we're the only animal that can recognize pareidolia. So chimps can't do it. Elephants can't do it. Smart animals that can't do this. That recognition of pareidolia, which we found animals in the mountains, and we found, we said, well, that looks like a dragon, or that looks like a chimpanzee, or whatever. That is what connected us to the great beyond. And ultimately, this sense of spirituality and unity. In most of these most cave images, they first found a crack in the wall, and then they put the animal in that crack. Okay. Picasso, very famous for his Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. People used to say it's African mask, all that sort of stuff. It's not. It actually comes from the Altamira cave in northern Spain. And there's these natural irregularities in the rock, and the cave artists put eyes and mouths on them. Picasso took those exact images and he put them in his Les Demoiselles d'Avignon in 1906, which became the rupture moment, the creation of modern art. So there was a time in our past when we couldn't recognize pareidolia, just like people have strokes today. So maybe it was closer to when we were the common ancestor of the chimpanzee, but we couldn't do it. And it's through that recognition of pareidolia that creates this entire world of Disney for us. And everything that we can group around, what we can tribalize around since then.
Yeah, so I guess in essence, even though we've got these stories that appear to go as far back as 35,000 BC. They still, I guess, are influencing how we tell stories today as well, even though they've been re-evolved through different cultures that have been brought it down to us.
Exactly, and that Joseph Campbell said that he had these different ages of the mythologies, but we still pick up the common. All artists pareidolia. Whether to be able to, you have to have the abilities to visualize pareidolia to see art. Some people who have stroke, they can't even recognize faces. So that's a very simple level. So yes, there's they went back in time 34,000, at least I'm going to say this is hundreds of thousands of years ago. I don't think it happened 34,000 years ago, hundreds of thousands of years ago. And, people could re-recognize those images in the rocks, in the walls that were previously made. They saw the hero, they saw the damsel in distress, they saw the villain, they saw the lion to overcome to become the champion, the ultimate predator, and they transformed them from the animist to the age of war, whatever, for the age of Greeks. I don't want to disrespect any Greek people. The age of war, and it's since changed them, but we've kept some of these fundamental underlying themes of the female animal helps the hero, and then in ancient Greece, the female helps the hero and maybe transforms into an animal to do that, and then we've continued on to a modern time, and now we project the same thing through Disney and Marvel Comics, and because we can't escape that animism, because it's almost what keeps us alive. It gives us creativity in life.
Yeah, it's saying that and like you said, you need that inspiration to find certain elements to bring the story out as well. And I guess for the Greeks, that was their trying to invoke the muses, trying to have another power bring them these visions or inspiration to tell these stories that are beyond, I guess, logic or
yeah, dreams. The muses. Yeah. Surface dreams, visions, and who knows where the visions came from? What stimulated visions, right?
Yeah.
But clearly, these stories had to come from another place, and they had mediums to do that. The muses, and people had dreams. It's a long journey, but it's a circle because we've come back. In most of the world, we've moved away from the militaristic sort of thing for most of the world, and to find common humanity, and that we now save the whales and save the dolphins, and if there's too few ants they become extinct, and we save the ants, right?
Yeah.
Because we've gone back to the recognition of a wholeness of animals and integrativeness, what Native Americans clearly had, and away from what the Greeks changed. But not just the Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, everybody in the so-called advancing civilization.
Yeah, tell their own stories, and I guess too that these, as we've said, they evolve. You have certain archetypes that stay present no matter what time period it is, and to keep the themes running. But depending on the society that it's in, whether it's more warlike or got a more peaceful existence, depends how the stories are presented, but you still find the same archetypes within the story. There's always like that common element. Exactly.
And in Disney, if you look at Disney, I don't harp on Disney because I'm a Disney fan.
Yep.
But I'm not not a consummate Disney person, but it's gives good fodder for this. 40 years ago, 50 years ago, all the Disney females were princesses, right? Okay. But now, change of social psychology, right? Social psychology. Most of the heroes in Disney movies are female.
Yep.
And so the Greeks changed from the cave artists in the same way we've changed in the last 40, 50 years. And the boys are pirates, right? Something like that.
Yep.
But there's still, so Mulan becomes the hero, clearly, but there's still a hero, and the hero goes through the same journey. her parents don't want her to do it. She's afraid to do it. She overcomes that fear. She goes on a journey. People help her on the way. In the case, most Disney movies, you have some sort of like animal, right? That supernatural animals which interact with the character on the journey. And animation and animism, they're from the same root. They are. There's a reason for that. And so, yes, we have we have changed in the same way that the Greeks shifted their structure of their way of reasoning to, because the Greeks need to do what they did to build these cities. They had to move away. They were destroying habitat. It's okay. Just like we plow down forests to build malls. Okay. They were destroying their habitat. They had to disengage from the natural world. Otherwise they couldn't do what they were doing. And now we've come full circle, as I said, that we have to start mowing down the malls and planting more fields, at least planting, flower beds between the malls, so that we can gain that, we don't destroy the whole circle of life, but we also find our connectedness back to the natural world. Yeah. And that's who I see as a person.
Yeah. Just basically it goes through waves where we go down too far down one track, and then I guess perhaps there's a correction where we then have to find our reconnection back to the natural world, to form those bonds again, and especially with the stories.
Yes, Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce famously said, Nez Perce in the Pacific Northwest, he famously said, "You can't eat money. What are we going to do with all the salmon are gone?" And to have salmon, you had to have the salmon had to go up the river to spawn. They had to be able to have food to spawn. There had to be actually rivers that could go up, and creeks. And for a long time, there were dams and things like that inhibited the flow of the salmon, the migrations. And so we're going back to this. So Chief Joseph and others in the Native American times, they yelled and we didn't listen. But in maybe like the 1960s, we went more towards this green revolution, that we need to clean up our waste, and you leave you can't leave a pop can in the woods. You need to take it back with you. But yeah, we can see these circular evolutions, and hopefully we don't destroy our planet, in the short term, so that we can enjoy it. But here's something. This is what I think. Well, first of all these caves are going to be closed, every one of them, because there's microbiological activity from people, and every cave is going to be closed. And there's going to be someday there are solar outbursts that we're not going to have podcasts. Okay? That all the electricity circuits going to be fried. It's not going to be today. It's not going to be tomorrow. It's going to be sometime in the future. It's inevitable, unless we figure out some way to do things without circuits. It's all going to be fried, and there's someday our great ancestors are going to be sitting around a campfire. They're going to be having our great offspring, yes, will be their ancestors. And they're going to be sitting around a campfire having these same discussions. And they're going to be looking up the night sky and they're saying, where did all this come from? And they're going to be telling fundamentally the same stories and myths that we tell today. And someone's going to, dig open one of these caves and look inside, and they're going to say, I know that story. I know that bear. And I know that hero, and I know that lion. These are stories that I've heard, through my great grandfathers. And I think that the Greeks and the ancient Egyptians and others, they've gone to these caves and they brought back a distant past. And someday we're going to lose that distant past, because it's just inevitable. It's just it's not going to be today, as I say, right? And I think the whole cycle is going to go over again. And that the data is that we will have first of all, we're going to have the abilities. We'll still have the pareidoia, the ability to see these things in the night sky. And then we'll have the mythology. We'll have the archetypes that structure the mythology. And then people will go back to not just these caves. They're going to go to the Native American, they'll go to Devil's Tower, and they'll say, oh my God, that looks like Gemini. And, they'll rebuild these myths within their own, whatever their societal belief is at that time. And so they'll never go away. They'll never go away because we refound them We did not invent them.
Yep.
And that's why you got a mythology in Australia that is like very similar to Native American and the constellations, because we see the same stuff.
Yep. So I guess, this gives us a really good view into your research and your work. So I thought perhaps we could maybe finish up looking at the whole concept of how this was transmitted to, say, other societies, because obviously you focus on the cave site in Spain.
Sure.
Are there other sites that are known to have similar type of images as well?
I'm going to give you a good example. I'm going to give it Ursa Major.
Yep.
I don't know if you see in Australia, Aboriginal people see Ursa Major as a bear, but we have Ursa Major as a bear in throughout Siberia. Okay, we have it in North America, and as not just a bear, as a she bear. Okay, as a she bear, and we have in the Upper Paleolithic images. And so and it's fundamentally the same story of Ursa Major and the bear through the seasons. We have Ursa Major in at least 5 caves, two of them before Orion, and I've done 4 more. I have a presentation coming out at the Arts and Society conference in 2 weeks that has more Ursa Majors. Now I have these Ursa Major bears from 12,000 to 27,000 years ago. Okay. So I say that the ancient Greeks and Egyptians and others have gone back to these caves and brought all this full inventory. But even if they didn't have the full inventory, people could have gone to any one of these caves and picked up the Ursa Major bear image. And they would already had their own belief system that, bears, they see the bear in the night sky and the bears on the terrestrial plane and all that sort of stuff. And so the Ursa Major could have been transferred between 34 with El Castillo to about 15,000 years ago across Siberia and across the Siberia into North America, and become that Native American myth. And we don't just find it one tribe; we find it a lot of tribes. The story slightly varies, but it's a North American myth. We also find a different version of it in ancient Greek mythology with Archetypes. So we have the record in both mythology, multiple caves in Iberian Peninsula, that it could have transferred it many times, and it could have been transferred multiple times. Yeah. So as people had gone back to these images, and people in the Basque people in northern Spain, they're like, I don't want to say like Native Americans, but they're truly indigenous people. They don't connect with anybody language wise anywhere. It's like a big mystery where the Basque come from. So the Basque people believe that they came from bears. That is in their tradition, because they have pareidolia in the mountain. They have the bear myths. They have the bear mythology in their caves, and so they carried it through to our modern time, just as the Native Americans did. Yeah. It's fascinating that we can have people who in their recent mythology, we're not talking, Hansel and Gretel sort of stuff. This isn't, people have been telling their children, their grandchildren, we came from bears in a modern time. These same people, the same Basque people, one of the major hobbies is to climb mountains at certain times of the year to go see to view other mountains. Whole families would go up there. And when the Romans came into northern Spain, they thought this was all, paganism, all that sort of stuff. And so they tried to get rid of it. And so they said, you can't do it. So the people still kept going to the mountains at, middle of the night and just watch at the sunrise, watch other mountains. And so the Romans, they put, monasteries and churches at the base of the mountains. So people they'd have to stop to do whatever the Roman priests wanted to do. Well, people just pass by the monasteries and churches, go up the mountains. So what they ultimately did is they put crosses at the top of the mountains that these people are climbing. And so the pilgrimage over thousands of years, or at least 2,000 years, became of the people to climb the mountain to visit the cross, as opposed to the original pagan belief of the people, so-called pagan belief, or animistic belief, of the people climbing the mountain to look into the cosmos.
Yeah.
And so it's fundamentally the same story. And but as a concept, churches are built on top of other churches, or temples on top of temples. And we can look at the Basque, who currently inhabit the northern Iberian Peninsula, Spain, and we can see these same traditions that we find in the caves, that we find in North America, and we find this in Siberia. And so if people can be reminded, whether going back to the caves or looking to the night sky or retelling the myths, it all carries on. And that's why I say when all the lights go out in some distant future, and my great offspring meets your great offspring, and sitting around a campfire, we'll be immortal by then, in their minds. But people, spoke through the air. But it'll be there because it's always been there, and it just gets reinforced every year through the seasons.
Yeah, the same themes, same archetypes will, like we said, are eternal, no matter what point of time they're found in.
And it's a protective mother bear too. And all these cave, it's all the protective mother bear. She's protecting her cubs, which again is, the mother bear, protective mother bear. How many times did you, the den mother, and we still use the protective mother bear today.
Yep.
Among humans, it's part of, we can't escape, we try, but we can't escape the animism with this. Arctos, the story, the she bear, Ursa Major story in Greek mythology is of a protector mother bear.
And I guess the thing I was trying to highlight too was, this is not a simple case of some Greeks wandered over into Spain, visited a cave, and then went, oh, this is interesting, and took it all back to Greece. This is a much more complicated process where it's probably happening over many generations. You've got diffusion taking place, then other people coming into the regions, visiting, taking bits and pieces back, then incorporating that into their own society and seeing how that fits into their world. And then that what we have now is the overall picture of what had developed, but what was a much, much more complicated process that was taking place.
The conquest of the Macedonians, Alexander the Great, opened up that door or that window. Yeah. And all flood. That was a flooding of it.
Yeah. And that's
Greece anyway.
Yeah. And that's where you see a lot more of the stories coming in, and even out to a lot of the Greek stories diffuse out east as well. And I would say that's a point where you see a mass influx and exodus of ideas. But I guess leading up to that point is you've got little bits and pieces coming into different parts of society that are built upon to create these bigger stories that become so big and then are transferred later on.
And I didn't realize that until I was doing homework for this podcast, and I printed out your timeline of history, of Greek history.
Yep.
And I saw the dates of how Eudoxus fits right into, and Plato fits right into the Alexander the Great history.
Yes, like I said, it creates it basically transfers the classical Greek world into what's the Hellenistic world, Hellenistic age. It just sees the diffusion of Greek culture throughout the known world.
So for the casting through the Greeks program podcast audience, that's the takeaway. That's how it connects.
Yep. And that's a period that we're still a fair way off of, but we'll be getting there over the years. But it would be actually interesting to see that diffusion of information and what that age ushers in elsewhere as well. So it'd be very interesting to delve into. But I think you've really highlighted a lot of the work that you've done. It's fascinating. I mean, I've watched a number of your videos on YouTube and looked on your website and looked at a lot of the images. I'll be putting them up on the website too, so that people can actually look at what we have been talking about and also visit your website. But I thought before I do go, do you want to direct people in where they should head to look more into your work as well?
Oh, absolutely. So I use Before Orion for everything. So my webpage, beforeorion.com. You get there, you can Twitter and Instagram images, Facebook pages, and all that sort of stuff. So people can, it's all free. And it's, in the end, it's not really mine, is it? Even though I had to buy the images. But it's out there for the world to explore and use. And I appreciate having time in this on your podcast, and we'll do it again someday.
Yeah, I very much appreciate you coming on. It's a bit of a sidestep to what we normally do, but it's fascinating nonetheless, just given how, I guess, it takes us further back into ancient Greek origins as well, that we can connect with. So thanks for giving some of your time to us today and taking us through it.
Thank you, Mark.
All right, thanks.
Well, this has to be one of the longest chats I've done on the series so far, and I definitely feel like we have room for more to talk about in the future. I hope you enjoyed the conversation and what Bernie had to present out of his research. I found it very fascinating, and it has provided me with much more food for thought on the notion of myth and the origins of these stories. I hope you liked how this chat unfolded, as I did not go into the interview with a set collection of questions. Rather, I was intrigued with the topic that I wanted to allow the episode to unfold with what was presented, and working questions to drive us forward from there. If you have found this episode interesting, you can find a lot more information through the links to Bernie Taylor's work I provided on the episode page, including the link to his book, Before Orion. You can follow Bernie Taylor on Twitter at BernieTaylorOR or at Before Orion. Otherwise, head over to www.beforeorion.com, where you can find much more on this fascinating topic. Next episode, I'll be releasing another interview episode. This time, I'll be talking with Dr. Owen Rees. We will be talking about his latest published work, Military Departures, Homecomings, and Death in Classical Athens. We also touch on the importance of relationships between the academic world of history and the popular history world. Then we start diving into the often overlooked aspects of war in the classical age through the experiences of Athens. Thank you everyone for your continued support, and a big shout out to all those who have found some value in the series and been supporting it on Patreon and other various ways. Your contribution is truly helping me grow the series. I would also like to give a personal shout out to a couple of new members over on Patreon. So a big thank you to Vupsi and Adrian Giacovani. I greatly appreciate your decision to jump on board. If you have also found some value in the show and wish to support the series, you can head to www.castingthroughancientgreece.com and click on the Support the Series button, where you can discover many ways to extend your support to helping the series grow. Be sure to stay connected and updated on what's happening in the series, and join me over on Facebook or Instagram at Casting Through Ancient Greece, or on Twitter at Casting Greece. And be sure to subscribe to the series over at the Casting Through Ancient Greece website. I hope you can join me next time for an interview episode with Dr. Owen Rees, The Athenian Experience of War.